Ethan found the puppy in a trash bag on the side of the highway. And when he carried it home, his hands shook not from the weight but from the certainty that accepting the small life meant admitting he could no longer carry his own. Heat rose from I-40 like a film no one could peel back, and Ethan drove with his knuckles white on the wheel, as if gripping tighter could reroute the wind. The AC hissed warm air that smelled faintly of burnt plastic. In the back seat, Aiden and Lily wrestled through bags from Smith's, whispering about who got the window seat for the ride home. Nora watched the road ahead, her shoulder pulling away when he changed lanes harder than necessary. Behind them lay Ruth's words, folded into a familiar stubborn knot. Home isn't a place. It's what you carry inside. He'd pretended not to hear. Nora hadn't corrected him. The turn towards Central Avenue came with a green light that moved the street like a hand through water. On the shoulder, near the sign for Lomas Boulevard, lay a black garbage bag with a tight knot, like an extra shadow someone forgot to dig. Aiden pointed first. Look. Lily pressed her palm to the glass, breath fogging the window. Inside the bag, something shifted, as though a shadow was trying to remember where it kept its body. Ethan pulled to the curb, clicked the hazards on. Nora was already climbing out, not thinking about dust or the knees of her jeans or who might ask questions. The knot didn't give at first, tied tight and trusting, like someone else's secret. The plastic tore with a familiar sound, and from the rip came a warm, trembling bundle. A puppy blacker than desert night, not yet believing in asphalt or hands or the idea that the world had edges. Eyes noticeably large, reflecting everything at once, road, sun, silhouettes, children's fingers reaching. Ethan took a step closer. Inside him, something stood at attention, not fear, but the habit of keeping perimeters at a distance. But Aiden held his fist out for the puppy to sniff. Lily laughed hoarsely through the tail end of her cold, and the sound became lighter than his own breathing. He looked in the rearview mirror. The hazard lights blinked orange. The street bent around them like a question mark. Keys jangled when he opened the back door, yielding not to the request but to the appointment, as if home had already decided, just waiting for him to catch up. The puppy settled between seat belts and cookie crumbs, smelling of sand and someone else's gun oil. His nose touched Lily's palm. His tail tapped the seat steady and sure, like a schoolroom metronome promising, now we'll learn for real. The car merged back into daylight traffic. The heat around them seemed to turn its head, to get a better look at the new arrival. Nora brushed an old receipt off her lap, where Ethan had written "Buy salt," and said, "Should we call him Blackie?" Lily whispered "Soot," testing the sound like candy. Aiden nodded, because it already fit the ear, quiet, like a nickname from a childhood secret game. Ethan didn't object. Their duplex on Morningside Drive knee was cooler than the car, concrete giving back shade as if it had hidden ice inside. The garage smelled of rubber, paint, and old snow they'd tracked in on boots a year ago. Ethan picked up the garbage bag by the door. It had stood there longer than usual, drinking light from its corner with blind persistence. He didn't hurry, palm working the plastic handles. The bag shifted and rustled thinly, not from movement, not from wind. Words he hadn't thrown out in time ground against each other, trying to form into a long, dry blade of meaning. Between layers of polyethylene, paper touched weightlessly. From where a receipt stuck to a brochure came quietly, "Call her." He swallowed, tilted his head slightly, as if listening to a bee trapped behind wallpaper. The puppy, sitting by his leg, lifted his gaze directly, seeing more in him than he was ready to show. Ethan covered it with the joke about talking trash, let out air shortly through his nose, and the puppy turned his muzzle toward the fence, as if someone had flipped off a light for a second. At night he checked the doors again and returned to the kitchen without turning on the overhead light. The kettle rumbled on the stove. Under the chair lay a warm creature, sleeping in appearance. From the garage came a barely noticeable rustle, no louder than a drip from the tap. "I'm fine," he told the table itself, and noticed how the shadow from the cabinet fell in the wrong place. On the counter remained a mug ring he'd have to scrub in the morning. He turned off the gas. The rustling quieted, as if someone at the other end of the house had stopped turning pages. Morning poured in dust and light, warm as bread left on the counter. Soot had dragged sneakers under the table and turned an old magazine into a map of torn white shores. Nora deftly removed the damp lacing, not scolding, just smiled with the corner of her mouth. Ruth arrived mid-morning, knocked on the doorframe with familiar severity that could be mistaken for kindness if not for her eyes, narrowed over her mug of coffee. "Wildness sinks in like a smell," she said in the kitchen, lightly rotating the spoon so sugar wouldn't settle on the bottom. Nora moved the saucer closer to the edge, as if saving it from spillage. Ethan leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, lowering his gaze to the puppy. "We'll manage." He tossed out the words like a jar of lead. Quick, dismissive. The puppy immediately turned his head to the window. His gaze slid beyond the glass, as if someone had been calling him there long and precisely. In the afternoon he walked with the kids to the 7-Eleven on the corner of Lomas and Carlisle. Milk and batteries. The air stood still and wouldn't budge, whether heat or the street itself holding its breath. In the parking lot 3 teenagers closed in like shadows from a visor, their words short with sharp edges. Aiden slowed his pace. Lily stepped back to the outstretched cart rail, fingers tightening on the metal. Ethan's throat dried like a stone arroyo in July. The sound came from far away, low and rumbling, covering the asphalt as if something trembled under the concrete crust. Soot, whom the kids had brought out for 5 minutes, "Please," emerged from a patch of shadow as if it were his door. He didn't growl or press forward with his paw, just stood between. The dark back filled the emptiness that demanded a voice. The conversation collapsed like a wrongly stacked pyramid of plastic cups. 1 laugh, 2 steps back, 3 pairs of feet running. The slap of cheap soles faded toward the intersection. Ethan raised his palm, placed it on for a what from heat, feeling how from inside something living and warm pushed into his palm, requiring no explanation. They passed the storefront silently, like sailors navigating a reef in the dark. In the evening he took out the garbage again. The bag grew heavy not by weight but by the density of silence inside. The rustling gathered into words, hoarse as a voice after a long drive. "Return the book. Tell your son you were wrong. Schedule the appointment." Paper edges scraped against each other, collecting sparks no one could see. He walked to the dumpster behind the building. Soot almost touched his calf with his side, matching his stride. "Tomorrow," he told the air, not lifting his head. The puppy turned toward the neighbor's yard, pupils dilating like at night in the hallway when you forget to turn off the TV, and then turned away. This movement seemed absolutely correct, as if someone had taken the music and turned it down a half-tone. Ethan stopped at the dumpster longer than usual, like before entering a classroom on the first day of school. The lid gave with a squeak like old radio broadcasts. He didn't throw the bag. He returned to the garage, put it back in its former place, palm lingering on the plastic as if touching something alive through a thin membrane. In the morning at the door, the mailman with a catalog smile. Letter from the insurance company. Letter from the bank. And a small postcard with neat unfamiliar letters, from a colleague who'd left long ago. Someone who knew how to ask in a way that made you want to answer even if there was no news. He put the postcard on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a blue seagull. "Need to call Mom," whispered the paper from the garage. He nodded to the wall. "Put the kettle on." Nora looked at him and the kettle like 2 points of the same drawing. She placed poppy seed rolls on the edge of the table, the ones Ruth had brought. "Save a couple for the neighbors?" He nodded instead of saying yes, a light movement of the chin. The puppy looked straight ahead without blinking, as if singing along without sound. The day stretched like a rubber band left on your wrist after a trip to the store. In the evening, he and Aiden went to the duck pond at Tingley Beach, holding Lily's shoulder at the crosswalk tighter than usual. Soot had learned their steps and moved alongside, not ahead and not behind, the way only those can who already know when to add pressure and when to wait. On the way back, he realized he was holding the phrase "everything's under control" in his mouth like a toothpick. It got in the way of closing his mouth, dried out his tongue, and he left it aside, like leaving a key on the windowsill that hasn't opened anything in a long time. At night the rustling grew louder. The house answered with creaking. The staircase where Aiden loved to sit in socks creaked on the second flight like an old ship adjusting its weight. Nora turned over in bed and moved the cool sheet with her palm, searching for a comfortable angle. Ethan went to the garage barefoot, linoleum cold under his heels. The bag sat in its place like an unclear thought assembled from 5 different halves. From deep inside came quietly, "Apologize first." He stood without touching it. Soot didn't move from the doorway but watched the way you watch someone trying to open a stranger's cabinet at night, alert, without judgment. "Tomorrow," Ethan said again, the word thin as tissue paper. The puppy shifted his gaze past his shoulder and didn't return it. Morning by the river began to sound before he could turn on the radio. Water at the edge was smooth as a receipt not yet marked with pen. Lily entered it in a cheap float ring from Smith's, carefully, shifting from foot to foot in the sand. Aiden played instructor, telling her where to hold her hands, squinting one eye as if from a sun lamp. Nora stood at the line where wet became dry, listening to how rubber hit water in small, rhythmic slaps. Ruth came without extra words. Her bag was open and full of familiar objects, not so much medicine as order, the kind you carry when you've learned to expect emergencies. The valve whispered thinly, like a whistle only dogs could hear. Lily didn't notice at first. The ring crumpled just enough for the water to find a voice, a soft hiss, then a deflation that sounded like breath leaving a chest. Air leaked out, and from this small collapse it suddenly became audible how Ethan was catching air with his mouth, and it wouldn't catch. Everything happened not fast and not slow, just somehow, the way accidents do. His hand missed for a second. He took a step, and sand slid slightly under his foot. And in that same second, Soot entered the water the way you enter a kitchen the night before a holiday, without asking and without looking back. He positioned his side under her grip, found the right angle as if he'd trained this his whole life, turned her so the current wouldn't pull her farther from shore. Nora fell to her knees and splashed water, reaching out her arms, not caring about the dress or her knees grinding into gravel. Lily coughed again, and between those two sounds appeared the thinnest gap. A whole life fit inside it, compressed and trembling. Ruth stood nearby. Her palm touched the wet fur, ran against the grain the way you stroke a flag if you've known its smell for a long time. Aiden's teeth chattered. He laughed and cried, not distinguishing where one was and where the other. The deflated ring was carefully pushed away with a foot, like an empty box no one wanted to look at. Ethan held his daughter by the shoulders, and from that touch his fingers finally thawed. That ice from the aluminum dumpster lid disappeared, the way it does when someone in the house quietly closes a window and warmth floods back in. After, home. Water in the pipe knocked like a small train approaching from far away, and a minute later flowed evenly from the tap. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wet fur. Soot lay by the fridge where it was cool, breathing deeper than usual, and each inhale returned to the room what had just gone from it for a second. Ruth placed mugs on the table, her hands trembling not from age, from the fact that inside everything still echoed with the river, with the sound of a child coughing out water. Nora cut rolls, moving the knife weightlessly so as not to press the soft centers, and folded halves onto a towel. Aiden retrieved an old jar of jam from the pantry, the kind brought in summer from another part of the country, and found on the glass a trace of someone's inscription, visible only if you looked at an angle. Ethan stood, went to the garage, not caring that wet tracks remained on the floor. Opened the door. The garage smelled the same, rubber, paint, and something no one could define. Something that lived in the corners where light didn't reach. The bag sat in its place. It didn't look heavier than yesterday, but the sound was quieter, as if the paper inside had tucked itself more softly, resigned to being forgotten. He took the bag, not pressing it to his stomach, just took it the way you take a child who can already walk but sometimes asks to be carried. Soot stood, walked alongside, not ahead. They went out to the yard. The light was no longer white but warm, like dust on a curtain backlit by afternoon sun. Down the street came the garbage truck, its sound not rough but working, precise, mechanical and faithful. It lifted the dumpster, metal quietly spoke to metal, and the bag went inside. No whisper, just a short sigh, as if inhaled into the chest and released without remainder. Back inside, the kitchen was the same and different. On the table a spoon rang against porcelain. He sat down and dialed the number he'd been mentally repeating for several weeks, the one scrawled on the postcard, the one connected to a voice he hadn't heard since last winter. The rings were short, strict. "Hi," he said, and in that word there were no excuses, just voice, his own, unguarded. He listened, nodded to himself, smiled not widely but genuinely, in a way that stayed on his face longer than polite smiles, deeper than reflex. Nora placed her palm on his back, not as support but as a mark. "All good, you're here." Ruth quietly said thank you to the dog, though it seemed that word was directed at something inside herself, some private reconciliation she'd been withholding. Aiden asked to touch the blue net on his arm from the water pressure, fascinated by the temporary tattoo left by panic and grip. Lily built a path from rolled crumbs to the dog's bowl, humming a tune no one recognized but everyone accepted. Soot didn't turn away when Ethan said, quietly, "I was scared," and looked comely, as if that's how it should be. Fear named, fear held, fear let go. Morning floated on. In the sky, colored balloons rose for the first time that season, part of the early balloon fiesta preparations. They were small from the window but clear enough that you wanted to count. 1, 2, 3, each a bright punctuation against the pale blue. Outside it was cooler than expected for late October. He put on sneakers, the ones Soot had chewed but not destroyed, and went out on the porch. The puppy already stood, carefully straightening his shoulder blades, ready without being told. They ran around the block the way people run who no longer have an invisible anchor catching at their heel. Steps came together like boards you could walk on again without looking down. Around them, what had always been, mowed lawns, kids with a soccer ball, smell of morning bacon drifting from open windows, someone closing the back door of a minivan, someone nodding without asking questions, just acknowledging the day. When he returned, warm light stood in the kitchen window like a cup left for you in advance. On the sink 2 mugs, one already empty, the other waiting. He poured coffee into it, held both with his palms like stones from the river, solid and cool and real. The house was quiet, the silence not empty but breathing, alive with the small sounds of a family waking, footsteps upstairs, water running, Lily's voice asking where her backpack was. Soot lay by the door, tail sweeping the floor in a slow, contented arc. Ethan sat at the table, elbows resting on the worn wood, and for the first time in months he felt the weight of the day ahead not as burden but as possibility, open, unscripted, his.